How did a former waiter from Solntsevo build one of Russia's most powerful crime networks? This is the story of how a neighborhood and one man shaped a new criminal model during the chaos of late 1980s Moscow. While the Soviet Union crumbled around them, Sergei Mikhailov was quietly assembling something unprecedented. He wasn't recruiting soldiers or politicians. He was gathering unemployed young men from his district, teaching them a different kind of survival. What started as desperate neighbors helping each other navigate economic collapse would transform into a global criminal organization. But first, Mikhailov had to make a choice that would change everything, abandoning his old life for something far more dangerous. In late 1980s Moscow, Sergei Mikhailov walked the same route home through quiet streets after each restaurant shift, his waiter's uniform still carrying the scent of cigarette smoke and cheap cologne from customers. He had spent years perfecting the art of reading faces across crowded dining rooms, learning which patrons needed another drink before they asked, which couples were having their first date, and which businessmen were closing deals over their meals. His hands moved efficiently between tables, his memory sharp enough to remember dozens of orders without writing them down. The work paid enough to keep a small apartment in the Solntsevo district, nothing fancy, but steady income in a world where steady meant everything. When Gorbachev's reforms began reshaping Soviet society, Mikhailov watched the changes from behind his serving station. The restaurant's customers started talking differently, whispering about new opportunities and old certainties disappearing. Some nights, government officials would arrive looking nervous, their usual confidence replaced by something that looked like fear. He served their drinks and listened to fragments of conversation about factories closing, about currency that might become worthless, about a system that was falling apart faster than anyone could fix it. These weren't his problems yet, but he filed away every worried expression, every anxious gesture, every sign that the world he knew was ending. The restaurant closed on a Tuesday morning in late 1988. No warning, no explanation, just a handwritten sign taped to the front door. Owner had disappeared overnight, taking whatever money remained in the registers. Mikhailov stood outside with 7 other workers, all of them staring at the locked entrance like they were waiting for someone to explain what came next. Nobody came. He walked home that afternoon with his final paycheck worth less than it would have been worth the week before, and realized that his old life was over. As the Soviet Union collapsed, legal and economic institutions weakened across the country, leaving entire communities without the structure they had depended on for decades. The government's new law on cooperatives and rapid privatization programs created opportunities that criminal organizations would soon exploit, allowing illegal capital to flow into legitimate businesses like casinos, banks, and transport companies. Under-resourced, law enforcement couldn't monitor the chaos that followed, creating a vacuum where organized groups could operate with little interference. His neighborhood transformed week by week. The corner grocery store ran out of basic supplies and never restocked. The local government office that handled housing complaints simply stopped opening. Young men who had worked in factories or construction companies began gathering on street corners during the day, smoking cigarettes and talking in low voices about what they were going to do next. Mikhailov recognized the look in their eyes from his restaurant days. the same desperation he had seen in customers who couldn't afford their meals but ordered anyway, hoping somehow the money would appear. He started paying closer attention to these conversations. Unlike the panicked customers he had served, these men weren't just worried about money. They were talking about survival in a world where the old rules didn't work anymore. Some mentioned friends who had found work with neighborhood gangs, small groups that offered protection to businesses for a fee. Others talked about opportunities in the black market, selling goods that the official stores couldn't provide. What struck Mikhailov was how disorganized it all seemed. These men had energy and desperation, but no real plan. No leader who understood how to turn their situation into something sustainable. His years behind the restaurant counter had taught him things these men didn't know yet. He understood how to manage different personalities working toward the same goal. He knew how to keep track of complex arrangements, remembering who owed what to whom and when payments were due. Most importantly, he had learned how to read what people needed before they said it out loud. When a customer was ready to leave, when they needed another drink, when they were about to cause trouble. These weren't criminal skills, but they were exactly the skills needed to organize desperate people into something functional. The moment everything changed came during a conversation with his neighbor, Victor, a former construction worker who had been unemployed for 3 months. Victor was describing his latest failed attempt to find legitimate work, his voice getting angrier with each detail. The employment office had no jobs to offer. The construction companies weren't hiring. Even the black market work was controlled by established groups that didn't trust outsiders. As Victor talked, Mikhailov realized that waiting for someone else to create opportunities was a mistake. The old system was gone, and the new system didn't exist yet. Someone had to build it. He began inviting Victor and other unemployed neighbors to meet at his apartment, not for anything criminal at first, just to share information about where food could be found cheaply, which government offices were still functioning, how to navigate the chaos that surrounded them. But as the weeks passed, the conversations shifted. Someone would mention a local business that needed protection from vandals. Another would talk about a store owner who wanted to buy goods that weren't available through official channels. Gradually, Mikhailov realized he was running something that looked less like a support group and more like a small business organization. What surprised him was how naturally his restaurant skills translated to this new world. Managing a busy dining room required the same abilities he needed now, keeping track of multiple conversations, understanding what people wanted without them having to explain everything, and maintaining order when emotions ran high. He could remember who had connections to what resources, just like he had once remembered who ordered which drinks. He could sense when someone was lying or holding back information, the same way he had spotted customers who couldn't pay their bills. By winter, 12 young men were meeting regularly in his apartment, and they weren't just sharing information anymore. They were coordinating activities, pooling resources, and making plans that extended beyond simple survival. Mikhailov had discovered that his years of service work had prepared him for something completely different, organizing people who had nothing left to lose into a group that could take advantage of a world where everything was available to whoever was smart enough and bold enough to claim it. But success would depend entirely on location, and Mikhailov was about to realize that his unremarkable neighborhood offered advantages that even he hadn't fully understood yet. Solntsevo district sat on the southwestern edge of Moscow like a forgotten piece of the city's puzzle. If you looked at a map in 1988, it would barely catch your attention, just another collection of gray apartment blocks and industrial buildings. The kind of working-class neighborhood that existed in dozens of variations around every major Soviet city. The buildings were functional rather than beautiful, constructed in the standard concrete style that prioritized housing people quickly over creating anything memorable. Most Moscow residents knew Solntsevo only as a place you passed through, on your way somewhere else, if they knew it at all. The district held no famous monuments, no government buildings, no cultural centers that would draw visitors from other parts of the city. But what made Solntsevo unremarkable to ordinary citizens made it extraordinary for someone thinking like Mikhailov. The district sat at the intersection of Moscow's most important transportation networks, positioned like a spider at the center of a web that stretched across the entire Soviet Union and beyond. Vnukovo Airport lay just minutes away, one of Moscow's 3 major international airports and the primary hub for flights to and from Eastern Europe. Every day, thousands of passengers and tons of cargo moved through Vnukovo's terminals, creating a constant flow of people and goods that would be impossible for authorities to monitor completely. The M3 highway ran directly through territory, connecting Moscow to Ukraine and continuing south. This wasn't just any road. It was one of the Soviet Union's primary trade arteries, carrying official government shipments, legitimate commercial traffic, and increasingly, the unofficial goods that moved through the gray economy that was expanding. As the official economy contracted, truck drivers making the long haul from Moscow to Kiev or Odessa needed places to stop for fuel, food, and rest. They also needed services that weren't available through official channels, and they carried information about what goods were scarce in which cities. The MKAD Ring Road formed another crucial element in Solntsevo's geographic advantage. This circular highway surrounded Moscow like a moat, and everything that entered or left the city by ground had to pass through one of its checkpoints. But the MKAD wasn't just a barrier. It was a sorting mechanism that determined how goods and people moved through the capital region. Traffic bottlenecks created opportunities for services like expedited processing, alternative routes, and temporary storage. The ring road's western section, which included Solntsevo, handled much of the international traffic coming from Europe. These transportation links created natural smuggling corridors that government agencies couldn't monitor effectively, even when they were functioning properly. With the Soviet system breaking down, customs officials and highway patrol units were operating with reduced staff, outdated equipment, and unclear authority about what they were supposed to be controlling. A shipment that entered Moscow through Vnukovo could be transferred to trucks and sent down the M3 highway within hours, crossing multiple jurisdictions where responsibility for tracking it was unclear. The district's industrial infrastructure provided perfect facilities for operations that needed to stay hidden. Dozens of warehouses and factory buildings sat empty as their former Soviet owners disappeared or went bankrupt. These structures offered large, enclosed spaces where groups could meet without attracting attention, where goods could be stored temporarily, and where activities could be conducted away from the residential areas where neighbors might ask questions. Many of these buildings still had working utilities, loading docks designed for truck traffic, and security systems that could be modified for new purposes. For Mikhailov, this geographic position represented something more than convenience. It represented control over access to Moscow's connections with the outside world. His years as a waiter had taught him to recognize opportunity, but his earlier experiences had taught him something else entirely. Before his restaurant work, Mikhailov had served time for fraud, a conviction that likely motivated his understanding of how legal boundaries could be crossed when traditional systems failed. This criminal record, rather than limiting his options, had given him insights that his unemployed neighbors lacked about operating outside official channels. Solntsevo's legitimate businesses were struggling to survive in the economic chaos, making them vulnerable to new arrangements that might help them stay afloat. Small shops needed reliable suppliers when the official distribution system failed. Transportation companies needed customers to replace the state contracts they were losing. Service businesses needed protection when the police were too busy or too underfunded to respond to problems. These weren't necessarily criminal enterprises, but they were businesses operating in a legal gray area where traditional rules didn't apply, and unofficial solutions were becoming necessary for survival. The working-class residents of Solntsevo found themselves in a situation similar to Mikhailov's original group of unemployed neighbors. Factory workers were losing their jobs as plants shut down or reduced operations. Young men who had expected to follow their fathers into stable industrial careers discovered that those careers no longer existed. Unlike residents of central Moscow, who might have more education or political connections to help them navigate the transition, Solntsevo's residents had fewer options for legitimate work and fewer resources to fall back on. This population became both a source of potential recruits and a customer base for services that weren't available through official channels. Young men with strong backs and no job prospects could be recruited for activities that required muscle more than specialized skills. Families struggling to find basic goods in the stores would pay for reliable access to items like food, clothing, or household supplies. Small business owners who couldn't get loans from banks might be interested in alternative financing arrangements, even if those arrangements came with unconventional terms. The combination of strategic location, available infrastructure, vulnerable businesses, and desperate residents created conditions that existed nowhere else in Moscow. Other districts might have some of these advantages, but none had them all concentrated in a single area that was small enough for a relatively small organization to control effectively. Mikhailov realized that claiming Solntsevo meant claiming the foundation for something much larger than a neighborhood support group. By late 1988, Mikhailov had transformed from an opportunistic entrepreneur running small-time schemes into someone planning organized enterprise during one of Russia's most chaotic decades. His apartment meetings were attracting more attention, and the men who gathered there were talking about bigger opportunities that would require more people and better organization. The question was no longer whether Solntsevo offered the right geographic advantages. It was whether Mikhailov could find enough desperate young men willing to abandon their old lives for something that didn't yet exist but promised survival in a world where survival was no longer guaranteed. The recruitment began with the simplest approach possible: shared meals and honest conversation. By spring 1989, unemployment lines stretched around entire city blocks, filled with young men who had graduated from technical schools and military service only to discover their qualifications meant nothing. Factory after factory announced layoffs or complete shutdowns, sending workers home with promises of future rehiring that everyone knew were lies. These weren't lazy men looking for easy money. They were skilled laborers, mechanics, drivers, and technicians who had expected to follow the same career paths their fathers had taken. Mikhailov approached young men he recognized from the neighborhood, guys who had been standing around the same street corners for weeks, and asked if they wanted to come to his apartment for dinner. His approach was personal rather than intimidating. He remembered names, asked about families, and listened to their stories about failed job searches and mounting bills. These weren't recruitment meetings. They were conversations between neighbors who understood each other's situations. The meals became regular gatherings where men could talk honestly about their fears and frustrations without judgment. Mikhailov provided more than just food. He offered information about which government offices were still processing benefit claims, which stores had received new shipments of goods, and which landlords might accept late rent payments. More importantly, he created an environment where men could maintain their dignity while acknowledging that their old lives were over. These weren't begging sessions or charity handouts. They were strategic discussions between people who were figuring out how to survive together. As winter approached and the economic situation worsened, the conversations shifted from survival tips to collaborative planning. Someone would mention that a local store owner was having trouble getting reliable deliveries of basic goods. Another would know a truck driver who was making runs to other cities and could transport items that weren't available in Moscow. Began connecting these pieces of information, helping facilitate arrangements that benefited everyone involved. The group wasn't committing crimes yet, but they were operating outside the official economy in ways that generated small amounts of income. Solntsevo's location, near the M3 highway to Ukraine, the MKAD Ring Road, and Vnukovo Airport, created opportunities that became increasingly valuable as the group expanded. These transport links meant that anyone who could establish influence over local operations had leverage over car imports and the movement of goods through Moscow's southwestern corridor. Control of these transport hubs allowed them to muscle into the car import business and other profitable lines that required reliable access to major roads and airport facilities. The training process developed naturally from these collaborative activities. Men who knew how to drive took responsibility for transportation tasks. Those with mechanical skills handled equipment maintenance and modifications. Former soldiers provided knowledge about organization and security procedures. Mikhailov's role was coordination and decision-making, but he made sure everyone understood they were building something together rather than just following orders. Each person had specific skills that contributed to the group's overall capabilities. The psychological transformation happened gradually rather than all at once. Men who had felt powerless and forgotten discovered they were part of something that could solve problems and generate results. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were building influence in their community. Local business owners began coming to them for services that the government could no longer provide. Residents asked for help with problems that the police were too busy or too underfunded to address. The group's reputation for getting things done spread throughout the neighborhood. When unemployment benefits and social services officially ended in early 1990, the choice between legitimate work and illegal activities became academic. There was no legitimate work to choose. The men who had joined Mikhailov's group found themselves in a better position than those who had continued waiting for the old system to return. They had income, purpose, and protection in a world where all three had become scarce. More importantly, they had learned skills that were valuable in the new reality: negotiation, organization, resource management, and the ability to operate effectively outside official channels. The appeal of belonging to something powerful became stronger as the group's influence grew. Members could walk through the neighborhood with confidence, knowing they had backup. If problems arose, they could provide services to their families that weren't available to other residents. They had access to goods and opportunities that existed nowhere else. This wasn't just about money, it was about respect, security, and the knowledge that they were part of something that was growing stronger while everything else was falling apart. Mikhailov structured the group's hierarchy carefully, making sure that early recruits understood they would have leadership positions as the organization expanded. Victor, his former construction worker neighbor, became responsible for recruiting and training new members. Another early recruit, Alexei, took charge of financial planning and record-keeping. These weren't arbitrary appointments, they were based on demonstrated loyalty and specific skills that each person had proven during the group's early activities. The informal training evolved into more systematic preparation as the group's activities became more sophisticated. New recruits learned not just practical skills like surveillance and negotiation, but also the group's codes of behavior and loyalty expectations. They understood that joining meant accepting responsibility for other members' welfare and success. They learned to think strategically about problems and opportunities, rather than just reacting to immediate circumstances. By the end of 1990, Mikhailov's original group of 12 unemployed neighbors had grown to over 40 active members, with a network of associates and contacts that extended throughout Solntsevo and into other parts of Moscow. The men who had gathered in his apartment to share meals and survival tips had become the core leadership of an organization that local businesses and residents depended on for services the government couldn't provide. They had money, influence, and a reputation for effectiveness that attracted both customers and potential recruits. However, Mikhailov understood that having a functional organization wasn't the same as having criminal credibility. His group could handle neighborhood problems and facilitate business arrangements, but they weren't taken seriously by Moscow's established criminal networks. To transform his survival organization into something that could compete in the city's underworld, he needed connections to the traditional criminal hierarchy that had commanded respect for generations throughout Soviet prisons and street culture. The solution came through an alliance that would reshape Moscow's criminal hierarchy forever. Jamal Khashidze had spent more than 20 years in Soviet prisons, earning his thief-in-law status through demonstrated loyalty to criminal principles and effective leadership of prison populations. He had survived multiple prison sentences without ever cooperating with authorities, maintained his criminal code despite offers of reduced sentences, and earned respect from criminals throughout the Soviet Union. His Georgian background gave him connections to criminal networks across the Caucasus region, while his long prison record provided credibility with Russian criminals who might otherwise distrust outsiders. In Soviet prisons, the title of Typhon-Law carried more weight than any government position or military rank. These were criminals who had earned their status through decades of prison time, unwavering loyalty to criminal codes, and absolute rejection of cooperation with authorities. A Typhon-Law never worked for the state, never served in the military, and never betrayed another criminal to the police. They settled disputes between criminal groups, managed prison hierarchies, and commanded respect that crossed ethnic and regional boundaries. When a Typhon-Law spoke, other criminals listened. When he made a decision, it became law in the underworld. When Kashidze was released from his latest prison term in 1990, he found a criminal landscape that had changed dramatically during his incarceration. The old Soviet system that had defined criminal activity was disappearing, replaced by chaos that created new opportunities for those smart enough to exploit them. Traditional criminal groups were struggling to adapt to the changing environment, while new organizations like Mikhailov's were emerging without proper connection to established criminal culture. Kashidze saw opportunity in this situation, but he needed an organization with the resources and ambition to take advantage of it. Mikhailov's organization had money, territory, and growing influence, but it lacked the one thing that mattered most in Russian criminal culture: legitimacy within the traditional hierarchy. Other criminal groups saw them as upstarts, former civilians playing at being gangsters without understanding the codes and traditions that governed serious criminal activity. Business owners might pay them for protection, and neighborhood residents might respect their ability to solve problems. But established criminals viewed them as amateurs who would eventually be eliminated by more experienced operators. The initial meeting between Mikhailov and Kashidze took place in a small restaurant in central Moscow, arranged through intermediaries who understood both men's situations. Mikhailov arrived with two of his most trusted associates, while Kashidze came alone, carrying himself with the quiet confidence that marked someone who had never backed down from a confrontation. The conversation lasted 3 hours, covering everything from Mikhailov's organization structure to Kashidze's vision for criminal opportunities in the changing Soviet system. Kashidze was impressed by what Mikhailov had built from nothing in just 2 years. The Solntsevskaya organization controlled valuable territory, generated steady income, and maintained discipline among its members. More importantly, it had grown without attracting serious attention from law enforcement or triggering conflicts with established criminal groups. This showed strategic thinking that many traditional criminals lacked, focused as they were on maintaining old practices rather than adapting to new realities. The alliance formalized when Kashidze accepted the position of chief advisor to Mikhailov's leadership council. This wasn't a traditional hierarchy where the Typhon-Law took command. Instead, it represented a new model where traditional criminal authority combined with modern organizational methods. Kashidze provided strategic guidance and external credibility, while Mikhailov maintained operational control over the day-to-day activities that generated income and expanded territory. The criminal codes that Kashidze brought to the organization weren't just abstract principles. They were practical guidelines that governed how serious criminals conducted business. Members learned that certain activities, like kidnapping or drug dealing that targeted children, were forbidden regardless of their profitability. They understood that conflicts with other criminal groups should be resolved through negotiation before violence, and that agreements made with other criminals carried the same weight as blood oaths. These traditions created bridges between Solntsevskaya and established criminal organizations that had previously viewed them as illegitimate competitors. Older criminal groups recognized Kashidz's authority and accepted that his endorsement made Mikhailov's organization worthy of respect. This opened opportunities for joint operations, territorial agreements, and shared criminal enterprises. That would have been impossible without proper criminal credentials. The credibility problem became critical. As competition for Moscow's criminal opportunities intensified, groups with connections to Typhonlaw leadership could form alliances, negotiate territorial agreements, and resolve conflicts through established criminal channels. Organizations without these connections found themselves isolated, vulnerable to attack, and excluded from the most profitable criminal enterprises. Other criminal organizations began approaching Solntsevskaya with proposals for cooperation rather than threats of elimination. The Typhonlaw connection made it clear that attacking Mikhailov's group would mean facing retaliation not just from Solntsevskaya members, but from the broader network of criminals who respected Kashidz's authority. By the early 1990s, Solntsevskaya's growing dominance faced serious challenges from Chechen criminal groups who had established their own powerful positions in Moscow's underworld. The Chechen organizations brought different traditions and methods, creating tensions that couldn't be resolved through traditional criminal negotiations. Mikhailov and Kashidze recognized that maintaining their territory would require forming strategic alliances with other Russian criminal groups, including the Vnukovo organization, to counter the Chechen challenge. The alliance with established criminal authority had hardened Solntsevskaya's reputation and provided the credibility needed to negotiate as equals with Moscow's most dangerous criminal organizations. But credibility alone wouldn't be enough to determine which groups would control the city's most profitable criminal enterprises. That question would be settled through violence that would reshape Moscow's criminal landscape forever. The confrontation came at Kazakhstan Cinema on Oktябrskaya Street in central Moscow, where neutral territory had become the last hope for avoiding open war. By autumn 1991, Moscow's criminal landscape had split into two distinct territories that rarely overlapped without violence. The Chechen criminal groups had established themselves as the dominant force in the city's most profitable enterprises, controlling everything from lucrative car theft operations to the emerging protection rackets that targeted Moscow's wealthiest businesses. Their reputation for extreme violence and clan-based loyalty made them formidable opponents who had successfully intimidated or eliminated most challengers to their authority. The tension between Russian and Chechen criminal factions went beyond simple competition for territory or revenue streams. This represented a fundamental conflict over who would control the future of organized crime in the post-Soviet era. The Chechen groups brought traditional mountain clan structures and warrior cultures that emphasized honor, revenge, and absolute loyalty to blood relations. Russian criminal organizations, like Solntsevskaya, operated according to different principles, focusing on business efficiency, territorial control, and profit maximization, rather than ethnic solidarity and blood feuds. Kazakhstan cinema's location made it neutral territory where different criminal groups could meet without appearing to favor one organization's neighborhood over another. The building's multiple entrances and exits provided security advantages for anyone concerned about surveillance or potential ambushes. Most importantly, the theater's regular evening crowds offered perfect cover for meetings that needed to appear casual rather than organized criminal gatherings. The specific dispute centered on protection payments from a chain of electronics stores that had become extremely profitable as consumer goods became available through private markets. The Chechen groups claimed exclusive rights to collect from these businesses based on agreements they had negotiated with the store owners months earlier. However, the Russian Criminal Alliance argued that the stores operated in territories where they had established prior claims and existing relationships with other local businesses. Attempts to resolve the dispute through traditional criminal negotiation channels had failed repeatedly over several weeks. Each side accused the other of bad faith bargaining and violations of agreed-upon protocols for territorial disputes. The Chechen representatives demanded recognition of their superior claim, based on their longer history in Moscow's criminal hierarchy. The Russian alliance, led by Solntsevskaya and their partners from the Vnukovo group, insisted that business relationships should be determined by efficiency and local control rather than ethnic precedence. The alliance between Solntsevskaya and Vnukovo had formed specifically to challenge Chechen dominance in Moscow's criminal enterprises. Both organizations understood that individually they lacked the strength to confront the Chechen groups, but together they represented a significant threat to the established order. Mikhailov's strategic thinking, combined with Vnukovo's reputation for violence, created a partnership that could compete with Chechen military capabilities while offering more sophisticated business operations. The meeting at Kazakhstan Cinema was arranged as a final attempt to negotiate a resolution before the conflict escalated to open warfare. Representatives from both sides agreed to attend with minimal security, hoping that face-to-face discussion might succeed where previous intermediary negotiations had failed. The Chechen delegation arrived first, positioning themselves in seats that provided clear views of the theater's entrances. The Russian representatives entered 15 minutes later, taking seats several rows away in accordance with security protocols both sides had agreed to follow. The conversation began calmly, with both sides restating their positions regarding the electronics store protection arrangements. The tone shifted when discussions moved beyond the immediate dispute to broader questions about territorial boundaries and future cooperation between Russian and Chechen criminal groups. Someone made a comment that was interpreted as disrespectful to Chechen honor, while the other side perceived a threat that violated the meeting's agreed-upon rules. The violence erupted without warning when one of the Chechen representatives stood up and reached inside his jacket. The Russian delegates responded immediately, assuming they were about to be attacked. Gunfire filled the theater as both sides drew weapons they had brought, despite agreements to meet unarmed. Theater patrons screamed and ran for the exits while criminal representatives fired at each other across the movie seats. The confrontation lasted less than 3 minutes, but when it ended, several men lay dead or wounded. And the relationship between Russian and Chechen criminal organizations had changed permanently. The aftermath sent shockwaves throughout Moscow underworld as news of the theater shootout spread through criminal networks. The Chechen groups, having lost several key leaders in the confrontation, found their position in Moscow severely weakened. Other criminal organizations that had previously allied with them began reassessing those relationships, concerned about being drawn into a larger conflict they might not survive. More importantly, the violence demonstrated that Russian criminal groups were willing and able to challenge Chechen dominance through force rather than just negotiation. Within weeks of the Kazakhstan cinema confrontation, Chechen criminal influence in Moscow began collapsing as Russian organizations moved aggressively to claim territories and businesses that had previously been off. The psychological impact of the theater battle proved more significant than the immediate casualties, as it established that Chechen groups could be defeated and that Russian criminals were prepared to fight for control of their own city. This shift marked Solntsevskaya's transition from street operations to strategic business integration. They bought or infiltrated casinos, banks, and were reportedly involved with Vnukovo Airport, using these legitimate businesses to launder money and gain political leverage. The violence had served its purpose in establishing territorial control, but lasting power would come through investment in sectors that provided both revenue and respectability. The criminal organization that had begun as unemployed neighbors helping each other survive was transforming into something that could compete in Moscow's legitimate economy while maintaining its criminal foundations. The victory over the Chechen groups had opened access to Moscow's most profitable enterprises, creating opportunities that would require new methods of operation and sources of revenue that could support rapid expansion. Moscow's underground gambling houses became the foundation for everything that followed. The basement of the Metropole Hotel hummed with the sound of slot machines and roulette wheels spinning 24 hours a day. Cigarette smoke hung thick in the air while men in expensive suits leaned over card tables, betting amounts that represented entire annual salaries for most Moscow residents. This wasn't an official casino. Gambling remained technically illegal in Russia, but enforcement had become impossible as government resources disappeared and police priorities shifted to more serious crimes. Dozens of similar establishments operated throughout Moscow by early 1992. And converted apartments where the wealthy could lose fortunes while the city crumbled around them. These underground gambling houses generated cash flows that dwarfed most legitimate businesses in the collapsing Soviet economy. A single busy casino could process hundreds of thousands of rubles in a single evening, with house profits reaching levels that traditional criminal enterprises like theft or extortion could never match. The customers weren't desperate residents betting grocery money, they were successful black market traders, emerging entrepreneurs, and government officials who had managed to accumulate wealth during the economic transition. These men arrived with briefcases full of cash and the expectation that their gambling would remain private and secure. The problem for casino owners was that massive cash operations required protection in a city where law enforcement had become unreliable and criminal organizations were actively seeking new revenue sources. Bank deposits drew government scrutiny that could lead to questions about income sources. Keeping large amounts of cash on premises invited robbery from criminal groups who understood that casino owners couldn't report thefts to police. Most importantly, the wealthy customers who provided the revenue streams expected security and discretion that amateur casino operators couldn't guarantee on their own. Mikhailov recognized the vulnerability before most other criminal leaders understood the opportunity. Casino owners needed exactly the services that Solntsevskaya had developed during their neighborhood protection operations, but on a much larger and more profitable scale. The organization could provide security for gambling operations, ensure customer safety, and handle the complex logistics of managing large cash transactions. More importantly, they could offer these services to businesses that generated revenue far beyond anything available in traditional criminal activities. The systematic takeover campaign began with careful intelligence gathering about Moscow's most profitable gambling establishments and calculating daily revenue flows. They learned which establishments had existing protection arrangements and which were operating independently. They studied security procedures, cash handling methods, and the personal habits of casino operators who would soon receive unexpected visits from Mikhailov's representatives. The approach followed a consistent pattern designed to minimize violence, while maximizing compliance. Two well-dressed Solntsevskaya members would arrive during slow afternoon hours when fewer customers were present. They would identify themselves politely to casino management and request a brief, private conversation about security services. The presentation emphasized mutual benefit rather than threats. Solntsevskaya could provide better protection than casino owners could arrange independently, while generating steady revenue for the organization through reasonable service fees. Most casino owners understood immediately that refusing these services wasn't really an option, but their presence made it clear that continued independence would become difficult to maintain. They provided specific examples of problems that other gambling establishments had experienced: robberies, customer disputes, police raids, and explained how proper security arrangements could prevent such difficulties. The choice between cooperation and confrontation was presented as a business decision rather than a criminal threat. Casino owners who agreed to protection arrangements discovered that Solntsevskaya delivered genuine value for their fees. Professional security personnel replaced amateur guards. Customer disputes were resolved quickly and quietly. Police raids became rare as Solntsevskaya's connections with law enforcement provided advance warning of official investigations. Most importantly, deterred other criminal groups from attempting to interfere with protected gambling operations. Controlling gambling houses meant controlling access to Moscow's emerging wealthy class during their most vulnerable moments. Men who lost significant amounts of money at casino tables often needed loans to continue gambling or to cover business obligations they couldn't meet. Solntsevskaya developed lending operations that provided immediate cash to desperate gamblers at interest rates that generated enormous profits. Casino customers who couldn't repay these loans became sources of information about business opportunities, government connections, and other criminal activities. The money laundering opportunities created by casino control proved even more valuable than the immediate protection revenues. Gambling establishments processed enormous amounts of cash from customers, whose income sources were often questionable themselves, converting illegal profits from other criminal activities into casino chips, then cashing out those chips as gambling winnings, created apparently legitimate explanations for wealth that would otherwise attract government investigation. The casinos became washing machines that could clean criminal money at industrial scale. By late 1992, Solntsevskaya controlled approximately 60% of Moscow's illegal gambling operations, generating monthly revenues that exceeded the annual budgets of many government agencies. This financial foundation enabled international expansion that extended the organization's reach far beyond Russia's borders. They sent Vyacheslav Ivankov to Brighton Beach to exert influence over Russian criminal activities in the United States. Other emissaries were dispatched to establish operations across Europe and Israel, with Israel serving primarily as a base for money laundering activities. The organization became active in multiple countries using these international networks to move money and coordinate criminal enterprises across continents. The global expansion faced periodic law enforcement challenges. In 2017, Spanish authorities arrested individuals suspected of links to the group during Operation Oligarch in Marbella, demonstrating that international law enforcement agencies were tracking their activities across multiple jurisdictions. However, these setbacks represented minor disruptions to an organization that had embedded itself deeply into both criminal that transformed them from a regional criminal group into an international organization with the capital needed for massive expansion. The steady revenue stream from protection fees supported operations that required significant upfront investment. The connections with wealthy casino customers opened opportunities for business partnerships, real estate investments, and political relationships that would have been impossible to develop through traditional criminal activities. Most importantly, the casino empire had generated the enormous amounts of cash that would soon be needed to take advantage of the greatest criminal opportunity in modern history. When Russia's government announced voucher privatization in 1992, they created the largest transfer of wealth in human history. The hammer came down on the auction podium with a sharp crack that echoed through the Moscow Convention Center, officially transferring ownership of the Volga automotive plant from the Soviet state to a private buyer for the equivalent of $12 million. The facility had employed 30,000 workers at its peak, produced over 200,000 vehicles annually, and represented decades of Soviet industrial investment worth hundreds of millions in actual value. The winning bidder was a shell company registered just 3 weeks earlier by men who had never worked in automobile manufacturing. They paid in cash, carried in metal briefcases that were counted on the auction floor, while government officials watched nervously and pretended this was normal business practice. This scene repeated itself hundreds of times across Russia during 1992 and 1993 as the government attempted to transfer state-owned enterprises to private ownership through what they called voucher privatization. Every Soviet citizen received vouchers that theoretically gave them the right to bid on former state assets, from massive steel mills to small service companies. The idea was to create a market economy by distributing ownership broadly among the population. The reality was that most citizens had no idea how to use these vouchers or lacked the additional cash needed to make competitive bids on valuable Enterprises, Solntsevskaya's organizational structure proved perfectly suited for exploiting this chaos. Unlike traditional hierarchical crime families, Russian organized crime groups operated as flexible networks with distributed leadership through councils of senior members. This entrepreneurial approach allowed them to adapt quickly to new opportunities, while maintaining resilience against law enforcement pressure. When authorities arrested individual leaders, the organization continued functioning through its network of experienced operators who could make independent decisions and coordinate activities across multiple enterprises. The group's standard criminal activities, extortion, racketeering, illegal gambling, arms trafficking, money laundering, and drug trafficking, had generated enormous cash reserves at exactly the moment when cash became the most valuable commodity in Russia's collapsing economy. Their casino operations had produced millions of dollars in ready money at a time when most Russian businesses operated through barter systems or struggled with worthless currency. Their connections with government officials provided advance information about which assets would be auctioned and what the realistic minimum bids would be. Most importantly, their reputation for violence discouraged other potential buyers from competing aggressively for the most valuable properties. The bidding processes became exercises in controlled corruption where outcomes were determined before the auctions began. Government officials responsible for conducting the sales received payments that ensured favorable treatment for Solntsevskaya's bids. Legitimate business owners who expressed interest in particular assets received visits from polite representatives who explained that continuing their bidding efforts would create unnecessary complications. Auction procedures were modified to favor buyers who could pay immediately in cash rather than those who needed time to arrange financing through legitimate banking channels. Mikhailov's organization targeted specific types of businesses that would provide both immediate revenue and long-term strategic advantages. Transportation companies offered control over shipping routes that could facilitate smuggling operations while generating legitimate income from commercial customers. Construction firms provided cover for money laundering through building projects, while creating opportunities to bid on government contracts. Import-export businesses created legal frameworks for moving goods across international borders without attracting customs scrutiny. The acquisition of Moscow River Transport Company demonstrated how effectively Solntsevskaya exploited the privatization process. This state enterprise controlled barge traffic along the Moscow River system, including cargo terminals that handled shipments throughout central Russia. The company's legitimate value exceeded $50 million based on its facilities, equipment, and exclusive operating licenses. Solntsevskaya acquired it for $3 million after other potential buyers withdrew their bids following conversations with organization representatives. Similar patterns emerged with the purchase of Industrial Construction Group, a firm that specialized in building warehouses and factory facilities. The company's client list included government agencies and major corporations that needed construction services, regardless of who owned the firm. Solntsevskaya's ownership provided legitimate explanations for large cash transactions, while creating opportunities to construct facilities that could serve dual purposes as storage for criminal operations and genuine commercial projects. Textile manufacturing complex in suburban Moscow represented another strategic acquisition that combined immediate profit with criminal utility. The facility produced clothing and fabric for both domestic and export markets, generating steady revenue through legitimate sales. However, its import operations also provided cover for bringing goods into Russia that might not pass close inspection, while its export capabilities offered methods for moving items out of the country without detailed scrutiny. Owning legitimate businesses transformed Solntsevskaya's money laundering capabilities from the simple casino-based operations they had used previously. Criminal profits could now be invested in business expansion, equipment purchases, and employee wages that appeared completely legitimate to government auditors. Revenue from illegal activities could be mixed with income from legal business operations, creating financial records that would be impossible to separate even during detailed investigations. These business acquisitions created relationships with government officials that went far beyond the simple corruption payments that had characterized their earlier activities. As legitimate business owners, Solntsevskaya leaders could attend industry meetings, participate in trade associations, and develop personal relationships with political figures who might not associate with known criminals. They could make legal campaign contributions, sponsor community events, and establish themselves as respectable members of Moscow's business community. Allegations of deeper connections to state structures emerged over time, with diplomatic cables later released by WikiLeaks suggesting possible FSB protection for the organization's activities. These reported ties, if accurate, would have provided layers of political protection that made law enforcement investigations much more complicated and politically sensitive. By the end of 1993, Solntsevskaya controlled assets worth over $200 million through their portfolio of privatized businesses. These enterprises employed thousands of legitimate workers, paid taxes to government agencies, and maintained business relationships with major corporations throughout Russia. The organization had successfully embedded their criminal wealth into Russia's legal economy in ways that would be extremely difficult to reverse, even if law enforcement agencies understood the full scope of their activities. The business empire provided financial resources and operational infrastructure that enabled expansion beyond Moscow's borders. Owning transportation companies meant they could move people and goods internationally without relying on outside services. Controlling import-export businesses created legal frameworks for establishing operations in foreign countries where Russian business investment was welcome. However, the domestic market, no matter how thoroughly controlled, had natural limits that would soon force the organization to consider opportunities that existed only beyond Russia's borders. International expansion began with a single man carrying 2 suitcases and a reputation that preceded him across the Atlantic Ocean. Vyacheslav Ivankov arrived in Brighton Beach, New York, on a tourist visa in 1992, known as Yaponchik because of his slightly Asian features. He had spent 10 years in Soviet prisons and earned respect throughout Russia's criminal hierarchy. His assignment was straightforward but extremely difficult: establish Solntsevskaya operations in the United States without attracting attention from American law enforcement agencies that were far more sophisticated and better funded than their Russian counterparts. Brighton Beach provided the perfect foundation for Russian criminal operations in America. The neighborhood housed the largest concentration of Soviet immigrants in the United States, including thousands of recent arrivals who maintained strong emotional and financial connections to their homeland. Many of these immigrants had left Russia with significant wealth that needed to be invested in American businesses or real estate. Others had family members still in Russia who required financial support or assistance with immigration paperwork. These needs created natural demand for services that traditional American businesses couldn't provide effectively. Ivankov began by establishing legitimate businesses that served the Russian immigrant community's actual needs while creating infrastructure for criminal operations. His restaurant on Brighton Beach Avenue became a gathering place where recent immigrants could eat familiar food, speak their native language, and conduct business according to cultural practices they understood. The establishment also provided perfect cover for meetings between criminal representatives and potential customers who needed services that existed in legal gray areas. The medical supply company that Ivankov registered in New Jersey appeared to be a normal import-export business serving hospitals and clinics throughout the Northeast. The company's legitimate operations generated modest profits while providing legal justification for international wire transfers, customs documentation, and business relationships with companies in Russia and other former Soviet states. However, the medical supply shipments also provided methods for moving items that weren't medical supplies while maintaining customs paperwork that appeared completely legitimate. Similar patterns emerged as Solntsevskaya expanded into Israel, where hundreds of thousands of Russian immigrants had settled during the 1990s. The organization's representatives established travel agencies that helped Russian citizens obtain residency permits. These businesses generated legitimate revenue while creating opportunities to facilitate immigration for people who might not qualify through normal procedures. More importantly, they provided natural explanations for frequent travel between Russia and Israel that enabled criminal operatives to coordinate activities across both countries. Spain became another crucial expansion target because of its location as a gateway between Europe and Africa, its growing Russian immigrant population, and its banking system that offered privacy protections attractive to criminals seeking to hide wealth. Solntsevskaya representatives purchased vacation properties along the Mediterranean coast that served as meeting places for international criminal conferences, while appearing to be normal real estate investments by wealthy Russians. These properties also provided secure locations for storing goods temporarily. During smuggling operations that moved items between Europe, Africa, and the Americas, operating across borders required understanding different legal systems, cultural expectations, and business practices. It meant establishing relationships with foreign banks, real estate markets, and government officials who had no reason to fear Moscow criminals. Most challenging of all, it required finding reliable people who could represent Solntsevskaya's interests in countries where the organization had no existing connections or influence. International banks and financial centers became essential. Infrastructure for managing the organization's global expansion. Swiss banking systems provided secure methods for storing wealth while maintaining privacy from government investigators. Caribbean financial centers offered incorporation services for shell companies that could own assets without revealing their true ownership. Cyprus developed into a crucial hub for moving money between Russia and Western Europe through banks that specialized in serving clients from former Soviet states. That the partnerships formed with local criminal organizations in different countries required careful negotiation and ongoing management. Italian-American crime families controlled traditional criminal enterprises in New York, but they lacked expertise in the computer technology and financial sophistication that characterized modern international crime. Colombian drug cartels dominated cocaine trafficking throughout the Americas, but they needed access to European markets and money laundering services that Solntsevskaya could provide through their legitimate businesses. These international partnerships created revenue-sharing arrangements that multiplied the organization's profits far beyond what domestic Russian operations could generate. Drug trafficking operations that moved cocaine from South America through Europe to Russia generated millions of dollars monthly for all participants. Arms smuggling networks that supplied weapons to conflicts in Africa, Asia, and Eastern Europe created steady income streams while serving the political interests of various governments. Money laundering services for other criminal organizations generated fees that often exceeded the profits from Solntsevskaya's own illegal activities. The organization continues to operate transnationally, with different sources estimating its influence and scope differently. Fortune magazine, as quoted by Guinness World Records, estimated the group's annual revenue at $8.5 billion in 2014, though estimates vary significantly depending on the source and methodology used. Many leaders have sought to legitimize their wealth through business, investments, and political connections, with allegations emerging of ties to high-level state actors, including diplomatic cables later released by WikiLeaks, suggesting possible FSB protection for the organization's activities. Authorities in several countries have investigated or arrested individuals alleged to be linked to the group. Spanish police conducted Operation Oligarch in Marbella in 2017, arresting suspected members, while FBI investigations have targeted Russian organized crime activities in the United States. These law enforcement efforts demonstrate ongoing attention from authorities, rather than evidence that the group has been dismantled. By 1997, international operations were generating the majority of Solntsevskaya's total revenue, transforming the organization from a Russian criminal group into a global criminal enterprise. The infrastructure they had built to support expansion created financial challenges that required completely new approaches to managing wealth that traditional criminal methods couldn't handle. The solution required building financial machinery that could handle transactions worth millions of dollars weekly across dozens of countries simultaneously. Moving $8 billion annually through the global financial system without triggering government investigations required methods that went far beyond the simple casino money washing that had served Solntsevskaya's early operations. Traditional laundering techniques worked for thousands or even millions of dollars, but billion-dollar criminal enterprises needed financial infrastructure that could process enormous transactions while maintaining the appearance of legitimate international business. The organization's accountants calculated that their global operations generated over $20 million in illegal profits every week, money that needed to disappear into the legal economy quickly enough to avoid detection, but enough to remain accessible for future criminal investments. The scale created problems that most criminal organizations never faced. Banks were required to report cash deposits above $10,000 to government agencies, making direct deposit of criminal proceeds impossible. Wire transfers between countries triggered automatic screening by financial intelligence units that looked for patterns suggesting money laundering. Real estate purchases with cash attracted attention from tax authorities who wanted to understand income sources. Even legitimate businesses couldn't explain sudden increases in revenue without providing documentation that criminal organizations obviously couldn't supply. Solntsevskaya's solution involved creating a network of interconnected companies, banks, and financial instruments that spread transactions across dozens of countries and hundreds of institutions. Criminal profits entered this system through businesses that generated large amounts of legitimate cash, restaurants, retail stores, and service companies where additional unreported revenue could be mixed with documented income without creating obvious discrepancies. A restaurant that served 300 customers daily could realistically report serving 400 customers daily, with the difference representing cleaned criminal money that appeared to come from normal business operations. The organization established shell companies in Cyprus, the British Virgin Islands, and Delaware that existed only on paper but maintained bank accounts capable of receiving wire transfers from around the world. These companies would invoice Solntsevo's legitimate businesses for consulting services, equipment purchases, or licensing agreements that never actually occurred. The invoices created paper trails that justified large payments from Russia to offshore accounts, while the shell companies' bank accounts received money that had actually originated from criminal activities in completely different countries. Real estate investments provided another crucial layer in the laundering process. Because property transactions involved large sums of money and often included legitimate reasons for privacy, Solntsevskaya purchased apartment buildings in London, office complexes in Miami, and vacation properties throughout the Mediterranean using funds that had been processed through multiple shell companies and legitimate businesses. These properties could be sold years later at market prices, converting criminal profits into apparently legitimate real estate gains that even sophisticated investigators would struggle to trace back to illegal sources. International financial centers became essential partners in managing this complexity. Swiss banks offered numbered accounts that provided privacy protection under banking secrecy laws. Liechtenstein financial institutions specialized in managing wealth for clients who preferred discretion about their assets' origins. Panama's banking system facilitated transactions between Latin American criminal organizations and their European partners without requiring detailed documentation about fund sources. Each jurisdiction offered specific advantages that served different aspects of the money laundering operation. The banking relationships required careful management to avoid triggering suspicion from financial regulators. Solntsevskaya maintained accounts at over 40 banks across 15 countries, ensuring that no single institution handled enough transactions to recognize patterns that might suggest criminal activity. Money moved through these banks in amounts that stayed below reporting thresholds, following routes that changed regularly to prevent detection. $1 million might travel from Moscow to Cyprus to London to the Cayman Islands to New York, with each transfer appearing to be normal business activity. When examined individually, recruiting financial experts who could design and operate these systems proved as important as recruiting muscle for territorial control. The organization needed accountants who understood international tax law, bankers who could navigate different countries' financial regulations, and lawyers who could create corporate structures that would survive government scrutiny. These professionals commanded high salaries and demanded guarantees about their personal safety. But their expertise enabled money laundering operations that generated returns far exceeding their costs. Corrupt officials in various countries provided crucial services that legitimate financial professionals couldn't offer. Banking regulators who received regular payments would delay investigations into suspicious transactions. Customs officials would approve import-export documentation without examining shipments too closely. Government tax authorities would accept explanations for wealth increases that might otherwise trigger detailed audits. These corruption networks required constant maintenance and careful coordination to ensure that payments reached the right people at the right times. The sophistication of Solntsevskaya's financial infrastructure attracted other criminal organizations who lacked the resources to develop their own international money laundering capabilities. Colombian drug cartels paid fees to move cocaine proceeds through the network. Italian crime families used the system to invest extortion profits in legitimate businesses across Europe. African arms dealers converted weapons sales revenue into clean money through shell companies and real estate investments. These client services generated additional revenue while spreading the criminal activity across so many transactions that investigators couldn't focus on any single organization. By the late 1990s, Solntsevskaya's money laundering operations had become so complex that even the organization's own leadership couldn't track all the financial flows without computer systems and professional staff dedicated to managing the network. The infrastructure that had begun as a necessity for hiding criminal profits had evolved into a business enterprise that generated billions in revenue, while making the organization virtually immune to traditional law enforcement methods. What began as street-level protection evolved into a model of mixing business and crime, a lesson in how systems change under stress. Mikhailov's modest background as a waiter, Solntsevo's strategic geography, violent consolidation of territory, and systematic business integration had combined to transform a local gang into a networked transnational syndicate. The financial machinery they built would prove crucial to their survival. But their greatest innovation lay not in how they moved money, but in how they structured power itself to withstand any attempt at destruction. This approach required abandoning everything that traditional organized crime had taught about leadership and control. When federal investigators arrested John Gotti in 1990, they destroyed the Gambino crime family's leadership structure within months. The same pattern had played out countless times throughout the 20th century. Law enforcement agencies identified the boss who controlled everything, built cases against key lieutenants who executed his orders, and watched entire criminal organizations collapse once their command structure was removed. Traditional organized crime groups operated like pyramids, with absolute authority flowing down from a single leader through layers of middle management to street-level operators. This hierarchical model made them powerful but also fragile, because removing the top meant destroying the organization's ability to function. Mikhailov understood this vulnerability from watching other criminal groups rise and fall during Moscow's chaotic transition period. He had observed how rival organizations collapsed when their leaders were killed or imprisoned, leaving their territories and revenue streams available for takeover by more adaptable competitors. The traditional fiefenal system that governed Russian criminal culture created similar weaknesses, concentrating decision-making authority in individuals whose arrest or death could paralyze entire operations. Solntsevskaya needed a structure that could survive the loss of any individual leader while maintaining coordination across its global operations. The council-based leadership model that emerged during the mid-1990s represented a fundamental departure from conventional criminal organization. Instead of a single boss making all major decisions, Solntsevskaya operated through a council of senior members who shared authority over different aspects of the organization's activities. Each council member controlled specific territories or business operations, but major decisions required consensus among multiple leaders. This meant that arresting or killing any individual council member would disrupt only a portion of the organization's activities while leaving the rest intact and functional. The council structure eliminated single points of failure that had destroyed other criminal organizations. When law enforcement agencies targeted individual leaders, the remaining council members could redistribute responsibilities and continue operations without significant interruption. Council meetings rotated between different countries and never included all members in a single location, making it impossible for investigators to capture the entire leadership simultaneously. Most importantly, the council could replace lost members by promoting regional commanders who had demonstrated competence managing smaller operations. Regional autonomy became another crucial element that made the organization nearly impossible to dismantle through traditional law enforcement methods. Solntsevskaya's operations in different countries functioned as semi-independent branches that maintained their own leadership structures, revenue streams, and operational procedures. The American branch managed its own money laundering networks without requiring approval from Moscow for routine transactions. European operations established partnerships with local criminal groups without coordinating every decision through the Central Council. This independence meant that successful law enforcement actions in one country couldn't destroy the organization's activities in other regions. The Obshok treasurer system provided financial coordination across this decentralized structure while maintaining operational flexibility. Each regional branch contributed a percentage of its profits to communal funds, managed by treasurers who operated independently from the operational leadership. These funds supported members' families during imprisonment, financed expansion into new territories, and provided emergency resources during crises. However, the treasurer system wasn't controlled by any single leader or location, making it impossible for law enforcement agencies to freeze the organization's assets by targeting specific individuals or bank accounts. Multiple treasurers managed different aspects of the communal funds through networks that spread across dozens of banks and financial institutions. Some treasurers handled member support payments and legal expenses. Others managed expansion funding and investment opportunities. Still others specialized in emergency resources and crisis management. This distribution meant that law enforcement actions against individual treasurers would affect only specific functions while leaving most financial operations intact. The decentralized structure enabled rapid adaptation to changing criminal opportunities, without requiring lengthy decision-making processes that could slow responses to time-sensitive situations. Regional commanders could pursue local opportunities independently, while sharing successful techniques with other branches through informal networks. New criminal enterprises could be tested in specific regions before expanding to other territories. Failed operations could be abandoned without affecting the organization's activities in other areas. This organizational flexibility proved crucial as law enforcement agencies developed new investigative techniques and international cooperation agreements. When traditional money laundering methods became too risky, different branches could experiment with alternative approaches and share successful innovations. When specific countries increased law enforcement pressure, operations could shift to regions with less aggressive prosecution policies. The organization could evolve constantly without requiring fundamental structural changes that might create new vulnerabilities. The structure also enabled Solntsevskaya to expand into criminal enterprises that required different skills and resources than their traditional activities. Cybercrime operations needed technical expertise and computer equipment rather than muscle and intimidation. Human trafficking required networks spanning multiple countries and corrupt officials in immigration agencies. Each new criminal enterprise could be developed by branches with appropriate resources and expertise while benefiting from the organization's overall reputation and financial support. Law enforcement agencies discovered that traditional investigative methods were ineffective against this organizational model. Undercover operations could penetrate individual branches without gaining access to the broader organization. Wiretapping individual leaders provided information about specific activities without revealing the full scope of criminal operations. Financial investigations could track money flows through particular networks without uncovering the complete treasurer system. International law enforcement cooperation faced similar limitations because the organization's structure didn't correspond to national boundaries or traditional jurisdictional divisions. American investigators might develop detailed intelligence about Solntsevskaya's activities in New York without understanding how those operations connected to the organization's European or Asian branches. European agencies could monitor money laundering networks without recognizing their relationship to criminal enterprises operating in other countries. By the early 2000s, other successful criminal organizations had begun copying Solntsev's decentralized model, recognizing that traditional hierarchical structures had become too vulnerable to modern law enforcement capabilities. The organizational innovations that had emerged from Mikhailov's practical need to survive. Government crackdowns had created something unprecedented in criminal history. What started as a survival mechanism for unemployed neighbors in a forgotten Moscow district had become a template that would influence criminal enterprises across the globe. Today, criminal organizations from Mexico to Nigeria use decentralized council structures, legitimate business portfolios, and sophisticated money laundering networks that mirror these innovations. What began as one unemployed waiter's response to economic collapse became the operating manual for modern organized crime. The transformation reveals how quickly desperation can evolve into global power when traditional systems fail. Societal breakdown doesn't just create victims, it creates opportunities for those willing to build new structures from the ruins of the old ones. Mikhailov's story demonstrates that the most lasting criminal enterprises emerge not from violence alone, but from understanding how to adapt when the world changes around them. Asterisk.